Hi everyone, in this video we are going to learn about validations. So far what we have done is we were sending data in a request body or in the path variable. What happens if the client does not send any data or sends invalid data in the request body or in the path variable? How would the service respond back? So there are chances that the service might throw an exception. It might throw from controller, service, or repository class, or it might even update the database with invalid records, right? So in such scenarios, what we have to do is we have to validate all incoming data. So before that, let's try to see, how we can send invalid data and the service response for those invalid or empty data in the request body or in the path variable. So we have our application up and running, and let's start with the create flight where I'm using post. What I'll do here is I'll just remove all the input data and I'm sending an empty request body. And if I click on send, let's see what happens. And you can see the service returned a 500 status, that is an exception was thrown, and it was thrown from the DAO, that is repository class. And what it says, it is saying not null property. So what is happening is this empty request body data is sent from client to the service and from service to the repository class, and in the repository it is trying to update the database, and that is where we have null constraints on the columns, and that is throwing the exception. So you can see that this bad data is being sent all over to the DAO. So we have to stop that. We should not be sending any invalid data to the DAO layer. Okay, so that is one issue. Now let's try to send some invalid data. So for capacity, for example, we have positive values, right? The capacity is nothing but our number of seats in the flight, and it cannot be negative. So what happens if we try to give some negative value? Okay, and also the manufactured on, it cannot be a future date. So let's try to insert this like 2032 and try to insert this future date and see what happens. Okay, and I click on send, and you can see that the record was inserted with invalid data. So this also needs to be caught at the controller layer and sent back to the client saying that invalid data was received. Okay, so this is something with the request body. Now let's see what happens with the path variables. So if we go to get, and if we try to send a negative, for example, we will see this, the get mapping, where we know that the ID, the flight ID, which cannot be a negative value here. Okay, let's refresh and see the negative capacity value. Yeah, the record was updated, but you can see the flight ID cannot be negative. But what happens if we try to send a negative value here, for example, -100 or -6, and if we try to send, what we get? We get an empty response. That means a query was executed with this invalid data. You can see here an SQL was executed here, right? So that also needs to be handled at the controller layer. So let's see how we can do that. So first, on the application, right click, select Spring, edit status, and here we're going to add validation. Okay, select validation, and in pom.xml file you can see that there is a dependency added called Spring Boot Starter Validation. So if you look at the Maven dependencies, and if you scroll down, and you can see that there is a package or a jar file added, Jakarta Validation API, and you can see that all this was added using this dependency. And in this, there's a package called JavaX Validation Constraints. So this has some inbuilt annotations that we can use to do the validation. Let's try to use few of them here. So let's go back to our controller, and we'll again start with our create flight. And we know that anything in the request body will be mapped to the member variables of the flight DTO. So the validation needs to be applied to all the variables here. And looking at the entity class, we know that all these variables are nullable false. That means they cannot be null. So we are going to apply the same here in the flight DTO. And we know that we have in the constraint, that is inbuilt constraint, we have something called not null. So let's use that. We'll use @not null. Okay, and the same I'll use it for the capacity, as it is a wrapper class integer, and also for the manufactured on. So I have added the constraint to my variables. Now let's enable it in the controller, and we can enable it using @valid. So this annotation will enable the validation on flight DTO. Okay, so now let's go back to our Postman and try to submit the flight here. What I'm going to do is first send an empty request body, and let's see what happens. If I click on send, and this time I get a data integrity. Okay, did I save all the files? I still get DEO, so let's see. I did not save it here. So let's save this file. Okay, now the server is up. Now let's try to resend this again. It still gives me DAO exception. I think I need a restart of the server. Let's do that. Yeah, it's sometimes that you need to restart once you add your plugin and all those. It requires a restart. Let's do that. Let's recheck if everything is all good. Yes, we added all null here, and also in the controller we enabled the validation. So let's go back to our Postman and let's click on send. And you can see that, yes, it was the issue with my server restart. After adding the validation dependency, I did not restart it. And you can see that exception is now status 400. And it says method argument not valid exception. That is validation failed. And it failed with 4 errors. We have added not null annotation to our 4 variables. And if you scroll down, you can see that all those 4 variables here with the message that says must not be null, that is our capacity and all the variables that we have in flight DTO. So that way we have now fixed our first issue, that is it cannot be null, a property cannot be null in our request body. And next, let's try to validate this capacity with negative. So for negative, we have again, if you go and expand our inbuilt constraint here, annotations, and you can see that there is something that we can use that says positive or 0. So that means we go here, and if you tell that capacity can either be positive or 0 value but cannot be negative. So for that we'll use positive or 0. Okay, now let's save this. And if we go back to our Postman and try to submit this, okay, I'll just keep this date for now as the past date because I'm testing this capacity here. And if I try to send, it should give me an exception, that is a validation exception that says flight DTO capacity rejected value is -70. If you scroll down and you can see the message, it says must be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so this is now fixed. Now let's go back and fix our manufactured on. So here we have a date, and for the date we have an annotation that says we can use something called, we have future, future or present, and similarly we have past or present and past. So let's make this as to allow only past value. So @past. Okay, let's save this and try to now give the future date here now. So if we try to give future date, and let's click on send and see what happens. You can see that there was again a validation error, and it says on manufactured value. That if you scroll down, it says the message must be a past date. So that way now we have validated our fields in the request body, right? So that way we can have validation to, if we have many other variables here, we can have validation to each field. Okay, so that way we fixed our create method. Now let's try to send it. Okay, now let's try to give this as 6161, and if I try to click on send, let's see what happens. And you can see that it was successfully inserted. So if you try to refresh, you can see it was inserted. So that way, we are making sure that we only send the valid data to our service, and from service to repository, and from repository to our database. If there is any invalid record that is in the request body, we stop it at the controller layer by validating it and send that exception or the information back to the client saying that there was an invalid data in the request. Okay, so now let's go and fix our path variable, that is get method. So if we go back to our flight controller, we have a get mapping, and here ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the constraint directly onto the method argument by using the constraint annotations here. Let's use, and we know that the flight ID cannot be a negative value, so let's use something called positive again here. We'll use @positive, and now we have added a constraint. We have to next do is enable it. So to enable the path variable or request params, we have an annotation called validated. Okay, this will now enable the validation on the path variables here. Okay, let's save this and go to our Postman. Now let's try to click on send. This time I should get an exception. Earlier we used to get an empty response. That means that if this -6 here, that is a flight ID, was passed on to our repository and the SQL was executed. But now it should not. It should be stopped at the controller layer. So let's do that by first clear the console, and if we try to send here, and you can see that we get an exception that says must be greater than 0. Okay, greater than 0 here. And if you go to console of our IDE, and you can see that there was no SQL executed. Okay, so that way we validate our path variables. So now what happens if you have a different scenario where your requirement does not if you are trying, whatever you're trying to implement, the validation is not available here. Okay, for example, assume that you want the manufacturers to be a list of approved manufacturers. Okay, anything out of the list, it is an invalid manufacturer. So in such scenarios, whatever annotations that are built in, that cannot be handy. You have to build something of your own. In such case, what we can do is we can write our custom annotations, custom validations. So how to do that? So let's try to create a custom validation. For that, let's create a package. I'll create a package called validation. And in this validation, we are going to create an annotation. So let's create an annotation, because we're creating basically this annotation will be applied to our field here. So I'll name this as flight MFD manufactured by, and I'm going to keep the retention policy as runtime. That means this annotation will be available during runtime for JVM. Okay, we have others like source and class. Source is nothing but when you write the Java file, and the class is nothing but this annotation will be available only at the compile time. And here we are using runtime because we need this annotation during runtime. Next, we have the target, and this tells where exactly you're going to use this annotation. I'll keep this as field. And documented is this annotation needs to be documented in all the classes where it is going to be applied when we create the Java docs. So let's click on finish. So now we have our annotation ready, and this we can use it on our flight DTO here on the variable manufactured by. Perfect. So now we create a constraint, but how the validation works? Okay, what it needs to validate? For that, we need to create a validator. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a validator here. And this class, this validator will implement constraint validator, and it's going to use the annotation that we created. And here the value that manufactured by is of type string. Okay, I created this in the wrong package. I have to move this to my validation. Let's do that. Okay, so now it's good. Now we have to do the implementation for is valid. So here what it's going to do is we're going to add our validation logic. For that, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a list of approved manufacturers, and this is going to be my approved manufacturers. And this, I'll give some dummy values like A, and CCC. So what exactly I'm trying to do here is any value of manufactured by that is coming in the request, other than these three values, I'm going to send back a response to the client saying this is not the manufacturer manufactured by that is in the request is not valid. Okay, so that is what we're trying to validate here. The first thing what I'm going to do is I will check if the value is same as null or value is blank, and is blank is from Java 11 that we can use. And if this is true, then what happens? We are going to return false. Okay, if it is null or is blank. Okay, and the same if now what I'm going to do is approved contains the value, then I'm going to return true, else I'm going to return false. Okay, and this is perfect. I'll just format it and save this file. So now we have our validation, that is our validator ready. We now have the logic that tells what exactly the annotation needs to do. It needs to validate this. And one thing that we are missing here is the constraint. We need to add the constraint here saying that this annotation is tied to this constraint here. So let's do that. And it takes the validator, and the validator is flight. Perfect. So now we have the constraint. Okay, now the message, what is the message that we are going to send back to the client? So that we can do by giving the implementation, the default implementation here in the annotation, saying public string, and I'll give the implementation for message, and I'll tell default, and here I'm going to give this as, I'll say the manufacturer value is invalid. Okay, perfect. So this is the message that we are going to send back to the client. So let's save this and let's restart our server to make sure that we don't get any error. So I hope you're getting what I'm trying to do. I just created a custom annotation, and for that annotation I created a validator to tell that what exactly it needs to validate. Okay, that is in my validator here. And in the annotation, I added a message that this message will be sent back to the client. So let's see what happens now. If I go back here, and this validation we added to the fly DTO for create, right? So let's do the create. Here, let's go to post, and now if here you can see the manufacturer ID manufactured by is not AAA or whatever the default values we have in our validator. So this should give me an exception, and it should be a validation exception. So let's do that. And you can see that I get an exception. It says contains constraint annotation. Okay, yes, we have the annotation here, the constraint annotation, but it says but does not contain a groups parameter. So this is not a validation exception, but this is something that we missed in our code. And I just wanted to create this exception so you guys know what exactly we are missing. We are missing something called groups parameter, that is groups implementations. For that, what we're going to do is give the default implementation for groups method, groups, and here the return type is basically the array of class. And let's save this. So what this basically does is, this is nothing but we are just trying to fulfill the standards of constraint. We are not giving any implementation for it, but it's just something that we add a boilerplate code here to fulfill the standards for constraint. Okay, the main thing that is we are using is the message here. Okay, now let's try to resend this. There is one more exception that is going to be thrown, but let's see what it is. And if I try to do again send, and this time it says validation error again, but does not contain a payload parameter. So we need to also add payload here. Okay, and this time it's going to be again class and extends payload. Okay, and this is going to be an array, and I'm going to do this as a default implementation, and this does nothing. Okay, and I'm going to import this from JavaX validation. Again, these two methods are nothing but to just fulfill these standards. All we are interested for now is the message here. Okay, so let's save, and now let's go back to our Postman, and now let's try to submit. Okay, let's see what happens. And this time we get a validation exception. You can see here it says method argument not valid exception. It says validation failed for argument 0, and it failed on manufactured by. And if you scroll down, let's see, look at the message, and you can see the default message. It says the manufacturer value is invalid. This is what we are going to send back to the client. So now I think now you're clear with what we did with the custom validation. We added an annotation, and to that annotation we added this standard, that is the constraint for the contract. Basically it's called the contract that we need to implement for using constraint annotation, okay, where the message is basically used to send the message back to the client, whereas the validator here does the actual validation on the value that is being sent in the request. Okay, so let's try to go back to our postman and give the valid value, and let's look at the valid value here. It is all small a, and let's try to send this. I'm going to change this value to 7171, and if I try to send, let's see what happens. And you can see that it was successfully saved. Okay, now if I try to send something called ZZZ, and let's see what happens. This should give me an error. Okay, before that, let's check our database if this value was successfully saved. And you can see that the value was inserted in the table. So now let's try to add something else other than the approved list here. And you can see that we again get the validation error. It says the manufacturer value is invalid. So I hope now you're clear with the constraints, inbuilt constraint annotation that we can use for validation. And also if there is something that you want to use, you want to create your own validation, and you can use the custom validations by using the validator, the constraint validator annotation or interface here. Okay, so that's all for this video, and I will see you in the next session.